Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to tonight's debate, hosted by The Observer. We're going to begin with some brief introductions.
Hi, everyone. My name is Megan. I'm fourth year Global Development and Politics at Queen's University. I'm one of the co-founders of The Observer 50/50 and also an editor at The Observer.
Hi, I'm Bryn. I'm fourth year Political Studies here at Queen's. I am the operations manager at The Observer and one of the co-founders of 50/50. To introduce tonight's participants, we have Emily, who is the president of the Queen's Debating Union, and she's in third year English. Livy is the secretary of the Debating Union, and she is in second year Politics. Brent is the vice president of the Debating Union and the critic, and he is in fourth Life Science. And Aiden is a general member in fourth Political Science.
So just to give some quick context, just to define some terms. So we're talking mainly about Twitter here, social media in general, but I guess for the context of this, Twitter is something that's like a social media platform and largely accessible, and I think that's really important here. We're specifically talking about like the US, potentially more Western liberal democracies, but I think like, again, to like have a smaller scope. And I think that just generally what's happening currently with the whole idea of censorship and like censoring fake news is that like social media companies are currently in the process of like determining how they want to do this. So I think it's in the early development stages, and they're trying to figure out like what their responsibilities and like the feasibility of this is. Okay, so 3 main points I think we bring on our side. What the point of Twitter is and like why people engage with it. 2, the way people perceive information and the like closing off of views. And then 3, who's actually doing the fact checking and like how this actually works. So to begin, what the point of Twitter is, I think the intention of Twitter is to create one larger community, but also to enable smaller communities where people can share their thoughts, ideas, draw conclusions on things, etc. I think like discussions like these engage with like things like politics, anything from comedy, like learning about influencers and educators. So I think that ultimately fact checking changes the nature of the platform, right? I think now what happens in terms of like wanting to suppress certain people or certain groups of people who have certain ideas, I think what happens here is like you actually end up making people more angry or like creating echo chambers. So what happens is like rather than actually like shutting down any of the false information, I think this doesn't change the way that this works in like the real world or the way this works in like other news sources. Just briefly, I think this actually makes people angrier, makes people like talk about it in different ways, and doesn't force people to like engage with other opinions or like actually like discuss these things. They just discuss them with people that they already have the same views. I think the second point here is like the way that people perceive information. And again, like furthermore, the closing off of views. I think like we talk like explicitly about Donald Trump in this whole idea or like this context of this notion, but I think like there's a certain idea of like where you draw the line and like who's actually impacted, right? Because I think realistically after this election, like if they implement the fact checking, it's still going to have to continue to exist. And then you have to think about like who that impacts and who they're able to censor. I think this also impacts, like, again, we'll get into this more probably later, but like marginalized voices, like different people like that. And I think this relates generally to the idea of like fact checking and who's doing it, because presumably you're getting professional fact checkers to do it. I think they still have some form of biasy. And like, I don't know, like if you're doing professional fact checkers, they'll have some sort of bias. If it's not professional fact checking, like these people aren't qualified. So I think you have to think about the way in which you do this. You also have to think about like the biases which everybody holds and who, like whether that's Republicans or Democrats in the future or like other people, who's actually fact checked. So I guess just briefly, for the reasons that we've outlined above, the idea of like what Twitter is meant for, how you close off certain communities, and like the nature of fact checking, we're proud to propose.
Okay, so in this speech, I'm going to argue why the Twitter checker is bad. I'm then going to argue why fake news should be widely available, but why there should still be some forms of censorship. That might sound contradictory, but I think the important thing that the previous speaker missed is that fact-checking is not the end-all be-all or the majority of what censorship is or what it constitutes. And we are against like fact-checking and that being something that exists like as a part of certain platforms. And we're going to talk about why. So first, why the Twitter check is bad. And the reason why it was bad is the reason why Twitter blocked this tweet and took it down is because it was trying to gain goodwill and benevolence from the incoming Democratic Party party in the United States so that it wouldn't have censorship forced on it from the state, and it would be able to run itself. It being able to run itself means Twitter is able to censor itself less and more able to like make money off of all of the people looking at QAnon shit and all of the advertisement money that gets from that, where they would lose it otherwise if it was censored. And so the reason why we think, however, that there should still be fake news and there should be limits on that is we think the label of what is or isn't fake or real news is something that always will be and historically has been abused by power structures and especially governments. We think that articles that said there aren't weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which was the truth, would have been labeled as fake news in the time after 9/11, and that would have made like the pursuit for a war in Iraq even better and curbed any opposition to that more. We think in the instances where fake news is something that is bad, like something like QAnon that I talked about before, or something that's explicitly white supremacist, for instance, we think that having something that says this is fake news built into a platform will just make people go to other platforms where that thing doesn't exist. And we don't think that that really accomplishes anything. And what we would rather have is, instead of just banning fake news for like these instances in which the group is hateful, we would rather have these sites just be censored for groups that are hateful or figures that are hateful. The key distinction I want to make here about hate is we think that hate is something that exists beyond a direct incitement to violence. And I meant to do this at the beginning of my speech, but just a brief content warning here. I'm going to briefly talk about like manifestos of some like mass shooters and white supremacists quickly. So you can just like mute me if you don't want to hear that. But in those manifestos of like the Christchurch shooter or of certain like involuntarily celibate men who commit violence, in those manifestos, they talk about online communities and YouTube commentators and YouTube channels that helped radicalize them and led them on this path to violence. So we think that when censorship does happen, we can censor things even if it isn't a direct incitement to violence, but it promotes hate and like the degrading of one group and their value less than others, or their like or like their failures as a result of something that being naturally inherent to them and their inferiority. What we've told you is why the Twitter checker is bad, why there should be censorship, but it shouldn't be focused around fake news.
Thank you to both sides. We'll now open it up to a 10-minute discussion.
I feel like largely like we talked about similar things, and there's not that much like discrepancy, but I guess on our side, we think that like the fact checker is probably like you guys think that there should be like something more than just the fact checker to censor, but like we just think none in general. So I guess like talk more about like the metrics that you would use to like actually censor or fact check.
So we think, for example, if like a white supremacist shooter talks about your YouTube channel or your Twitter in a manifesto, that's probably grounds for you to be taken down. We also think things about like you as a person associating with certain groups that have done violent things, like the Proud Boys, for example, that would be grounds for you to be taken down. Things that you might have done in the past or associated with like basic rhetoric about things, linking to things like I think it's pretty easy to like establish the things that we're looking for. And I think even it's much easier to establish whether or not something is hateful and like centering around the degrading of like one group than it is to discern whether or not something is true in the majority of instances where something like that would matter. Where if something is fake news, where that's going to be applied, like if fake news is a rule on Twitter, where that's most likely going to be applied is not in like issues of fact and science like shit, but in like personal disputes of things that are online on social media that can or can't be used as evidence that people are then getting to get taken down. So I think on our side, the metric is like easier and clearer.
So like, I guess my question is then like, how do those two interact? Like, I don't think neither Livy nor I disagree that like hate speech and speech that incites violence, for example, should be taken down, and that's probably true. But like, how does that interact with your arguments around why like some actors are worse actors to engage in these acts of censorship, for example?
Okay, so I think it's just that like Twitter, when they do censor people or through the Twitter checker, they're not doing it for their own benefit or to like actually take down content that is bad or that people think is like hateful, for instance, which is what Ada and I think they should be taking down. They're taking down content to get political buy-in from like Democratic parties who like need their support and like are willing to pay that money for them, you know? So it's not really that they're getting like I don't know. I think when you're censoring things in terms of like the Twitter checker and in terms of like Twitter themselves doing it, it's not really like with good intentions, and as a result, it's something that can be abused and exploited by a lot of governments within the world, and they do already do that, right? So like the way Donald Trump uses fake news like on Twitter to like call shit out is something that like I think would become more prevalent and more important in the like in the cases where you have a Twitter checker specifically. What we say is like we want a different kind of censorship.
Well, like, I guess just like one thing on like Trump, for example, in the Twitter checker, I think there are instances in which like Twitter does do things that don't necessarily align with their best interest as a company. For example, the fact that like Trump is someone who has just drawn like presumably millions of people to the platform for better or for worse and has engaged with it. Like, despite that, they have engaged like on a goodwill basis, I believe, in these acts where like they put disclaimers, right? And like about the arguments about being pushed to other platforms, for example, like with Twitter, it's not that they censor Trump's tweets and don't let anyone view them, right? It's rather that, for example, above it they put a disclaimer that this, for example, may contain false information and that this may not be accurate, and redirects people to other sources, right? So people have a better ability to actually like be able to be informed, right? This also happens, for example, in political debates that are hosted by broad like networks like CNN and ABC, for example, who also have profit incentives. They also have things like journalists doing fact checking, right? And that's something that's broadly accepted as good. So I'm just wondering where like you think the difference lies.
Okay, so firstly, the reason that people who are conservative will leave Twitter when Donald Trump gets censored isn't because they can no longer view that content there. It's because Twitter is now something that's biased against them. That's more of a reason for them now to go to like 4chan and 8chan where they can be anonymous and not have it tracked at their job and be even more racist and shit now. And the other thing I think in terms of talking about political debates, I think political debates are another example about how this idea of journalistic integrity and objectivity is generally used and exploited by power structures and by elites, especially in America, in their own interest. Like if you look at the majority of questions that someone like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren will be asked, it will be, how will you pay for this thing, right? Even though that's a ridiculous question and all of their campaigns have put out tons of explainers explaining how to do that thing, right? But then when they ask, say, Joe Biden a question about racial justice, they don't do anything to actually go into his record and contextualize what it means to ask Joe Biden, one of the authors of the crime of like a historic crime bill in the United States, a question about racial justice in the first instance. So I think that's actually a very good example about how this tool of allowing Twitter to be another way in which powerful people in society were able to verify what is true and what is false and use that for their own interests. And that is entirely what Brent and I's case is. I just have a question about your case. What do you think makes the value of Twitter different from a different social media site?
What do you mean, like where Twitter differentiates itself from Instagram, for example, or?
Any social media site. Why does Twitter specifically matter, and like it being the one that's fact checked?
I can hop in here. I think like for one reason, just in the context of like the US election, it's something that like is being actually just utilized, like I think on the grounds of like who uses it, like, and it's also just the way that it is where you can engage more explicitly with people. Like I think this kind of rhetoric doesn't happen on something like Instagram because people don't tend to respond to the comments, or like it's not as explicit there, or like it doesn't happen like this on something like Facebook because that's not it. I think Twitter is like a way to like really easily talk to people and engage. And I think that like that kind of goes back to what we were talking about, where it's just like it's really important that people are able to fully engage and fully talk about these things regardless, whether or not we think these things are like correct or wrong or like politically correct, because obviously there are things that like shouldn't be said and things that should be held accountable, but I don't necessarily think that your metrics are the way that that works best.
Yeah, like we just thought like I think in terms of like how the fact checking thing works, because that was like a big part of your case or something that you talked about a lot, is just that I think Twitter in particular, like, why are we saying Twitter is the one that should be fact checking things, you know? Because in a lot of cases, like, even if you have just censorship on Twitter, like Aiden pointed out, a lot of these people are just going to go to other sites or websites where they can engage in this content again. So it's like, even if you have a Twitter checker in place, like, it's not like it's stopping those problems. It's actually just pushing them further underground because you can no longer see those sites because those communities are like more insular and more insulated and you can't really see them as much, you know? So it's like, I don't know that like Twitter censorship specifically is like the best way to go about things, you know?
But I guess like kind of going back to what you're saying, right, where it's just like Twitter is like this really main central hub. I think that the most people probably engage with politics there in a way because like Donald Trump has made it centralized, right? Like he has legitimized the platform, right? I think that to an extent, like the other platforms you're talking about aren't somewhere that like, even though I know Twitter's not the best place for political rhetoric, like those other platforms are known to be echo chambers, are known to be those things. And like you're saying, if you're somebody who's racist, sexist, whatever, you're going to try to engage with that content either way. But I think when you create metrics in like something that is legitimized and something that is recognized by like CNN doesn't talk about all those other places that you talk about. But when this is something that is now formalized and now is actually addressed, I think placing them perhaps, or even just like addressing censorship in some sort of way is important for that platform.
I don't know. I think 4chan and Reddit are talked about on media already all of the time. And I think that like there seems to be right now we're arguing over like how would this change how people engage in Twitter when it's now fact checked or not. But I think there's a couple of issues of having Twitter now be a thing on which like there's now some things that are verifiably true and verifiably not true that they haven't talked about for their side yet. Like this is something that now makes this, if you want to read the news and get an informed opinion, well, Twitter's fact checked. That means that these things are better. Or if something hasn't been fact checked, this is true and this is something that I can believe. And that's not necessarily always the case. And the thing you read on Twitter probably isn't going to give you the full understanding of the situation in the way that an article might. And I also think that having, like, just in terms of pushing people to other sites, I think an important reason why we want to have people be on Twitter and not have something about Twitter that makes it polarizing and makes it so that people will go and have their political discussions elsewhere, especially if they already want to be in an echo chamber or even if they don't, because Twitter isn't really aligned to have conversations. It's much more about like putting out tweets and jokes that then get likes and not about engaging with people. But this just makes people leave Twitter as a platform even more. The reason why that's really bad is when you say like all of the hateful things that you do on Twitter, that's something that's usually linked to your name and your persona more so than other sites. You can just hold those people accountable more, like have them be fired for their job and things that are similar. We think those are things that are just and like good ways of retribution and deterrence for those things.
So I will cut the debate off there. I ask both teams to do their 4-minute conclusion, and then we will end the debate.
Okay, so largely what we've talked about in this debate is in the context of like social media, for example, whether or not Twitter should do things like they are currently doing in the status quo, which is publishing things like disclaimers and redirecting people to articles. For example, the articles that we put in this discussion that we writ large both sides thought were good, whether or not they should redirect people to more accurate sources of information, right? And this happens largely in like cases where there are just cases of verifiable truth or false, right? We're not saying truth or falsehood, right? We're not saying that like Twitter will likely engage in censorship and in all instances and like censor people's opinions, for example, and polarize people further to the left or to the right. Because one, given that like both sides have already acknowledged that social media platforms do have profit incentives to maximize the views, the like amount of people that engage with it, right? So I don't think that it's like as drastic as like opposition would point it out to be, insofar as that they do have incentives to like draw lines and to like determine in which cases is it worth it to actually engage, right? In the case of Donald Trump, for example, as with, for example, Cambridge Analytica on Facebook, these were instances where it directly posed a threat to American democracy, right? We don't think like your average person who doesn't have that many followers and who is just posting like their hot takes maybe is going to get censored because Twitter, that doesn't align with Twitter's profit incentives, right? Also, like, I don't necessarily know why they would build that infrastructure just to like do the minutia of censoring. Rather, they'd likely be focusing on like large scale issues that are just verifiably false and like like they can be verified as true or false, right? Like with Donald Trump, for example, the fact that like Fox News also said that the president was spreading fake news, despite being a right-wing platform. Sorry. Also, on the idea of like people going to underground platforms like 4chan and to like more underground platforms where like you have like hate spreading more frequently, right? Several things here. One, recognize that like the reason people will still engage with Twitter in the status quo is just because it's largely accessible, right? We don't think that Donald Trump, for example, is just going to go 4chan because this isn't where the predominant, like his predominant followers are, right? This isn't where, for example, he gets the most views, whether or not it's a matter of truth or falsehood, right? Secondarily, we think that like platforms like 4chan, for example, are just platforms that are branded as like far right platforms that are filled with hate speech, for example, right? So the number of people migrating to these are probably the same people who are more likely going to be far right on Twitter, right? So you're not losing that much. Where it actually differs, like on the other hand, is like the idea of like moderates and people on the left who are actually harmed, right? For example, there are just moderates who are going to read Trump's tweets and not know whether or not this is true or false, right? There are people who are going to be more susceptible and who don't likely like have incentives to do things like read articles because most people are just busy in their day-to-day life and they like engage with Twitter as a form of social media and a form of entertainment rather than like political discourse, right? These are the people that are the most harmed, I think, on opposition side of the house when they talk about things like fake news and censorship, right? Recognize that, like, again, this isn't like direct censorship, but it's posting things like disclaimers, right? Like, for example, movies and like TV shows, like TikTok does that all the time. If they're just like stunts, they put a disclaimer that like says this might result in serious injury, right? It's just meant to more so contextualize it. And we do believe that in the more broad majority of cases that this is like an act of goodwill that people engage in because of the reasons we outlined, right? With the fact that Twitter has profit incentives, that they likely have larger operational issues, so they won't deal with the minutia and more likely to deal with like large-scale controversial issues. And just the fact that this as a platform has been a platform of political discourse and should be regulated to an extent. For those reasons, proud to propose.
The opposition side is going to stand up here and tell you that the average person is not just going to leave Twitter because, you know, they've been censored or biased. But the reality is that when Trump got censored by Twitter in the status quo, a lot of his supporters left because it legitimized all of the rhetoric and all of the narrative that he was saying. So when Trump goes out there and says, look, I'm being censored or I'm being attacked, or my votes aren't being counted properly, look, the system is rigged against me. You legitimize that when Twitter then censors them and says, look, yes, we are rigging the system against you. We are trying to make it harder for you to win. So these are the reasons why these people are actually going to leave Twitter, why they are going to go into 4chan and these other sites. I also want to point out that in slash poll on 4chan, Donald Trump has the 5th most visited website. So what that means is that a lot of these other Trump supporters are going to these other platforms and are becoming more insular and are becoming more insulated, and that really sucks, right? Because we're trying to make sure that these people like are engaging within the other frameworks, are engaging within the other primates of society. Okay. The other thing that Emily tries to stand up here and tell you is that, you know, the moderates out there, they're going to read this and they're not going to know like what is true, what is wrong. They're not going to be able to buy into certain things. Okay. The first thing we would say is that we do not think Twitter should be the people who gets to say what is true and what is false. The reality of the case is that's what Aiden talked about for literally 3 minutes straight. But the other thing that I want to point out is that the average person doesn't just engage in Twitter and isn't just stupid. When they read Trump's tweets online, they already have probably some sort of opinion about it or some sort of prior knowledge about it. That's why they're engaging with it in the first place, right? So they're not just like these stupid people who don't know what they want to be told or not. They're reading these things so that they can understand these kind of issues or that they can like basically form their own biases or their own perspectives on them. And I think that's something that takes down a lot of their case. Okay, what are the things that Aiden talked to you about that I thought were really important? So I think Aiden gave you a lot of good reasons as to why we think giving Twitter legitimacy is just a bad thing. They want to talk about how fact checking is a good way to like determine what is true and what is false and what like we should be able to censor, what we shouldn't. But the reality is the way Twitter fact checks currently through the fact checking system is through ways that has ties to political parties is through ways that has exploitation, is through ways that has opportunities for coercion and for like different buy-ins, because there's political parties that are involved. And so ultimately what that means is that Twitter, in a sense, because it's such a political platform, and that's the way people are engaging with it as mainly a political platform, or that's the way we've talked about it, at least within this 10-minute discussion. What that means is that you're going to be excluding some people no matter what, because different people have these different biases. So when Twitter aligns with certain sides, it automatically pushes a bunch of those people out. And as a result, it just dictates what is true and what is false. Actually, all of the harms that they want to talk about how people believing that something is true or something is wrong and it not being actually true or wrong are actually happening on their side of the house when Twitter gets to say literally what is right and what is wrong. And I think that's something that's pretty sad. Aiden and I think differently. We think censorship is something that should happen on Twitter, but it should not be done by a Twitter fact-checking bot. It should not be tied to political parties that have outside influences that will push people out and push people further into the ground. We think it should be done based on what is hateful, what is not allowed, what we think is like racist or sexist, or like specifically in the cases of hate. We think those are things that we should be banning on or censoring in terms of Twitter, because those are the things that will ultimately lead to the best outcome. At the end of the day, I think what's really important or the question that you need to ask yourself is Twitter a legitimate platform? Is Twitter the way we should be using censorship? We think that it is not the way we should be using censorship, or we shouldn't be giving it the only or sole purpose or like ability to decide what is true and what is false, because ultimately we think they're biased. So yeah, proud to oppose.
That concludes our first debate. I'm going to launch a poll momentarily so the audience can fill out their side. Just as a refresher, I'm going to give you our question again. So does the Twitter checker constitute an act of censorship, or should fake news be widely available to the public at their own discretion? We have for at 45%, against at 10%, and then undecided at another 45%.
An echo chamber is a metaphorical description of a situation in which beliefs are amplified or reinforced by communication and repetition inside a closed system and insulated them from rebuttal. By visiting an echo chamber, people are able to seek out information that reinforces their existing views, potentially as an unconscious exercise of confirmation bias. This may increase social and political polarization and extremism. So this leads us to our second debate topic. Does social media help or hinder democracy, or does it encourage echo chambers among people with similar ideologies and discourage partisanship? So we'll begin with our first team. You have 3 minutes for your opening statement, and the opposition will follow with their 3-minute opening statement.
Okay, amazing. So what Livia and I are arguing for is that recognize that social media and democracy and how they interact has been an issue since its inception, right? With people interacting with it in a variety of ways, ranging from like communicating with their friends to spreading political messaging, right? And although there have been concerns of polarization and echo chambers harming democracy through social media, recognize that a lot of these harms aren't exclusive to social media. For example, individuals generally engage with friends like who share similar political beliefs or views, and the neighborhoods they grew up in, for example, in the communities, are generally like politically similar, and they have similar socioeconomic statuses, right? So that kind of political segregation already exists. What is exclusive to social media, however, are its benefits, and these are the benefits that Livia and I argue for. Firstly, recognize that like prior to social media, a lot of the ways in which you had to get information was through things like political advertisements and traditional news sources, right? Which gatekeep and determine what is important and what is not important for people to generally view, right? The platforms that like people had were generally controlled by a select number of people, and this dictated the type of information that people had access to, right? Recognize that in social media, it becomes a lot easier to spread things like messaging, particularly political messaging, and this is especially beneficial for grassroots movements and organizations, right? For example, this summer, the Black Lives Matter movement, despite people being indoors and at their homes, it still sparked massive like buy-in and mass engagement because people were doing things like sharing information and sharing factual sources about what happened and encouraging their friends to get engaged, right? This is a general type of engagement that is positive that you don't get anywhere else because, for example, with like traditional news sources, right, you have to like actively go out and seek this, right? What is exclusive to social media is that this is a platform that people use for a variety of sources, and this is the most effective way to spread information, right? Secondarily, for example, also with like Black Lives Matter movement and SARS, these were things that weren't widely covered, or there were aspects of it that weren't widely covered by news sources, right? And that people only had access to once people who were actually on the ground and at these events spread that information through social media, right? These were things that the like traditional news sources deemed to be like inconsequential and people would have otherwise not had access to. Why is this then important for engagement? Recognize that like people engage with social media in a variety of ways, particularly people who may not be otherwise engaged in politics and news sources, right? For example, people who might not be politically active and might not read the New York Times and the politics section still are able to get a lot of political news and sources from their friends who share this information, right? There's wider reach and breadth of audience, and information is better disseminated. For those reasons, proud to propose.
Okay, so we have one argument for you, and I want to make it very clear what that argument is. We are going to argue in 3 different ways how social media, more so than other forms of traditional political entertainment or mass media, makes politics into an entertainment, a sport, and a cultural event, regardless of political ideology. We're going to argue how this is harmful. So I want to make clear, the way that social media makes politics into a participatory sport, entertainment, like event and cultural event, like different than say 24-hour news media, is that you are a participant in it. You are not just retweeting what Donald Trump said, you are commenting on it and refuting all of the libs who are also commenting there under it. You have your own account where you put out your own, you have your own account where you put out and distribute your own media. You have like feuds with other people on Twitter and talk about that and discuss it, and you get likes and followers and incentives to continue doing that thing and buy into those like serotonin outputs. That is how that's something that's different. So the 3 ways in which this happens and how it's bad that we're going to talk about. Firstly, on the left and liberals and how this leads to performativity, because a focus on it as an entertainment, sport, and cultural event, specifically on social media, a medium mediated only through text, this leads to focusing on like obsession of a purity in speech and performance rather than addressing the material needs of people, because things that are performative will go more viral. So for example, Nancy Pelosi ripping up Donald Trump's speech probably got her a lot more support than doing actual things to address the people most harmed by COVID or just generally in society, which are also marginalized and racialized people who she will systemically ignore, while still wearing a kente cloth and kneeling after George Floyd died without still doing anything about police reform, right? That is the type of politics that social media allows and emboldens, and it's the type of politics that we have regardless of if information is able to spread more, right? On the right, what this leads to is an obsession with cultural infringements and perceived persecution and of being put in a position that's now inferior by people like the white working class or white upper class. And the reason why social media enforces this is it allows evidence of this to be distributed and relayed and to have insular groups where people can talk about it and radicalize each other, where they can still exist within a society where that narrative doesn't exist, but still believe it themselves. And the issue with that is you have people like the white working class who now vote and act on cultural grievances rather than what their material needs are, which would be things in line with not the non-white working class. The last way in which social media is harmful for democracy is that social media works best for ultra-conservative and hate groups. And this is because you can discuss subversive and violent ideas easier through anonymity, and it allows people through new internet cultures of irony to experiment with radical ideologies while still being able to distance themselves from them. And the internet also allows these people to find each other and isolate in groups and use things like edgy humor to recruit people and edge them into it. This is why social media is bad for democracy.
Okay, thank you so much to both of our teams for your opening statements. We will now open the floor to a 10-minute discussion.
So you guys talk a lot about all of the like negative things and like the radicalization, but like in the status quo without social media, like how would you see all of the positive things that we suggest actually happening without this tool, right? Like where does all of the communication come from?
Yeah, good question. So first off, I think the internet still exists, right? I still think something like Signal, which uses end-to-end encryption, which allows like Black Lives Matter organizers to communicate without surveillance by the government or police, still exists without social media. So you're still able to have at least grassroots movements exist and operate. We can see that you lose things like mass buy-in or like people putting black squares on their Instagram. But I think our point about performativity shows exactly why we don't really care about losing that thing, right? Because having something where everyone shows up to this one event and it's a huge cultural event, then means that if the leader just shows up to that and is a part of that and they don't go on and do anything else about it, just like everyone else did, that means that's fine and they don't have to go and address a systemic issue, right? We're fine with protests not being something that people allow and just show up to and have just something that's continuing going on and they're okay with it. We would rather have it be something that actually forces politicians to change and they can't co-opt under this broader narrative of just associating with the movement without doing anything about it when you have the power to.
So like a couple of things. I think it's like interesting that you mentioned the internet still existing and for example having like apps like Signal or whatever where like people still can like engage and collectivize in the internet, right? I think broadly speaking, when you're talking about the harms of the far right and people being able to coalesce and gather on the internet, that these are symmetric, right? So I don't think that's what we're talking about. But I think secondarily, what Livia and I are trying to argue for is that the difference with social media and other internet groups is that the barrier is lower, right? People engage with social media in their day-to-day lives, for example, by engaging with their peers and by engaging with each other in a variety of ways, right? Whether it's through humor or politics, and these like eventually trickle down, right? So for people who may not otherwise have access to political information and might not have the incentives to like go on like sources like the New York Times, for example, or go on Signal and collectivize under these sources, right? These are the people who are impacted and learn a lot from it, right? We're willing to concede that like some of that might be performative, but we still think that like you're able to better galvanize politicians and, for example, convince them that Black lives actually do matter and that this movement should be taken seriously when there's just a mass outpouring of support, both like on social media and like on like in actual protests, right? Whether or not those are performative, we're willing to accept that harm, but these are things that like would otherwise not exist.
Okay, so first off, I think there's already lots of disincentives for someone who isn't engaged in politics to get engaged in politics in the first place. So I think it's problematic to focus those people as the ones who like are most important for democracy, especially because it's unlikely for them to like eventually get a lot more engaged in politics. And the reason for that is if you are one individual who has to work a job or is tired from that job and has to devote most of your time to be able to survive, or even a large portion of it where you also want some time for recreation, news media is not only designed not to be something that teaches you what's going on, but is instead talking about it as it's happening, as if it were a sports game. But there's also very little incentive for you just to learn anything about politics because there's very little benefit that it will actually give you in your life, right? You're probably better spent just using that time to gain a skill or work another job than you are learning about politics, because as one individual, that's unlikely to ever bring you any direct benefits. So I think if they're just trying to lower the barrier to make that easier for people, I don't think that is anywhere near as big as a like boost and good for democracy as all of the harms we give you of like why like hate groups are better able to use these things and how this better enables actually progressive and left-wing politicians to not have to do anything to still get votes from people who are left-wing or progressive. I think those harms are a lot more worse than having a few less people less interested in democracy overall.
I can keep going. I also want to point out, like, on the thing where you're talking about how, like, the right can't utilize social media websites as easily or, like, as well as, like, the left, so it's, like, a symmetric harm. I actually do think it's worse on the right, and the reason is because of, like, the isolation factor, right? So it's, like, when you're in a social, like social media is able to create, like, uniquely insular communities in a way that is different than any other kind of website is able to, or anything else on the internet, right? Because you can only engage, like the thing that Aiden said, one about anonymity, so you can experience it without like having to share that with everybody else, but also the fact that like when you feel pushed out, like you get like further down the chain basically, and you get to like these really insular communities in a sense, and that's where you get like it like that's how you breed the kind of worse outcomes, because you just have a bunch of people who have like like-minded things confirming each other's beliefs and like not having anyone else have that kind of input in there. And I think that's more especially worse on the right, where they're less critical of certain ideas, where I think on the left you have at least some critical thought or some ideas in terms of like questioning like what is correct or what is wrong kind of thing.
Okay, I guess to start like a new, like kind of branching off something new, like if we look even just, I know we've kind of talked about this, but like I don't think that you've actually provided like a metric to do this in another way. So if we look at just this summer, right, where we're like real life in quarantine and we don't have social media and George Floyd still passes away, how do people actually collectivize? Like we see like this past summer, like I know it's not the most insane movement towards Black Lives Matter that's ever happened, but perhaps it is, right? Like, and most of this started from social media, right? Most of these people aren't on, I don't know what app you talked about where people collectivize for movements, but like Emily's saying, right? Like I didn't know that that existed. And if I'm a person that still wants to be involved or doesn't know about it, you tell me that people are incentivized to be engaged with politics. But I think in the status quo, that's like a normal conversation now, right? When we talk about BLM, people are still incentivized because they either have a radical opinion on either side. People are incentivized with the election to like know more. And I think that that would not have happened. We wouldn't have as large a voter turnout as we do if people weren't forced to engage. You tell me about echo chambers, but I think that those exist because people had to form an opinion, right? People had to like actually have like a thought about politics. And I think that that doesn't necessarily happen, or you have a less chance of being able to branch out when you are still born into some Republican family in the middle of the countryside where your opinions probably weren't going to be changed anyways, versus now there's like a higher chance.
Okay, I just have two things to say. So firstly, I think an important thing with our case that they haven't talked about yet that we told you about is how under this, with social media, and this is a question I want to ask them, whether or not they think that tweeting or making Facebook posts is political action or something that makes up or equates to that in any way, or to what degree. Because I think that's largely a perception that exists under like having social media be politicized, but we think that that is ultimately a falsehood. And even if it leads to more people doing something and that thing being engaging on the internet, it leads to a focus where people are able to look at things happening on the internet, specifically politicians, and signal those things as being successes, as being parts of those cultural events or not. So when Livy talks about there being big, massive protests, we're okay with those protests being a lot smaller, because in our world, it is a like political climate in which progressive leaders are less able to not do anything about the killings that have been happening throughout all of history and all of the like racial injustices that still haven't been corrected. So I think we're okay in some instances of having there be less ability to mobilize certain people. Oh, sorry about my screen. My computer behind just went off. But sorry, what was I saying? We're less with having less people coming out and mobilizing, if that means that any form of activism that exists at all is more able to get change.
So like on that, right? So like I think that like whether or not Facebook post and Instagram post about the Black Lives Matter movement, whether or not they're performative, is like they're probably symmetric, right? There probably are some people who sincerely care about it, and there probably are that just don't, right? But on the idea of smaller protests and political leaders not being able to like do performative actions, right? I actually don't think that's true when there are smaller grassroots movements, because recognize what matters to politicians is not like the intensity by which one individual cares and how those collectively add up, but rather just having enough people come out, right? By the fact that this is probably like a salient electorate that they should pander to and appeal to, and one by which they should care for, and like these movements actually have rather large backings, right? I think without it, for example, like with what Livy mentioned, a lot of people probably wouldn't have found out about George Floyd, or if they did in like traditional news media, there probably wouldn't have been that many people who cared, right? So even if, for example, there were smaller groups of people who demanded action, but who all cared to the same intensity, politicians don't have an incentive, because now you can't, for example, call them out on social media and call them out for the things they're doing. You can't spread that information to massive amounts of people, right? And we do think that like politicians' incentives do to an extent just align with like the like number of people that engage with us rather than like your authenticity.
So that will conclude the discussion portion of our debate. We ask that the first team present their 4-minute conclusion, followed by the second teams.
Okay, so I think what we largely get out of our opposition is this like really big importance for like ethical purity. And I think that like that probably comes from a place of like really wanting people to fully engage with the content. For example, like this debate was largely about BLM. So I think that that's like a good thing, right? You want to have particularly strong individuals who like care about these movements. But I think that, as Aiden proves to us, those already exist, right? On their side of the house where there's like no social media or like whatever, or like social media is like bad, those people probably still already care, right? Before George Floyd, there were already people who were like ringleaders for these movements. What we give you is we give you more numbers. As Emily just explained to you, we think the most beneficial thing that comes out of our side of the house is literally just in terms of lobbying, is like political and like voting power, right? I think that when Aiden and Brent tried to tell us that like, you know what, these politicians think that they now like have done something significant, that individuals are convinced that things are getting better, et cetera, et cetera. I think when we look at like the way that people vote and we look at like converting people to a more progressive side, I think that this probably happens with social media when you have the most accessible stuff. I think when Aiden and Brent tell us that like somebody who's like working a 9-to-5 job doesn't have time for politics, I just largely don't think this is true, right? And I think that that's better on our side of the house because these people are already engaging with their like phones, already engaging with social media, right? When you went on your Instagram feed in like May, June, July, and like eventually it started to die out. But for those 3 months, you could not avoid this content, right? If you said like, I don't want to get political on my Instagram feed, you were literally like asked questions. You were like shunned by your friends. You were all of these things if you like had a relatively like decently progressive group. And even just in general, because you probably follow somebody to that extent, right? I don't think this happens in regular everyday rhetoric. I think in the same way that they tell us that like hate groups are like more amplified in this way, I think what also happens is that like people aren't as scared to like talk about progressive policies. People aren't as scared to say, you know what, like I actually like care about this thing, or I'm against this like white supremacist guy that goes to my school, when you can go online and you can try to engage with them and you can say your piece, right? I think when Brent and Aiden tried to tell us that like, I don't want like all those people at the rallies, I don't want them at the BLM necessarily like protests, I think that what that does is it just continues to shut people out, right? If you only want the most intense individuals, how do you think you get them, right? You get them by having them be exposed to the people who genuinely care about it, right? By going to a protest, like one individual, if you're caring about that individual's like ethical purity, that individual's ability to engage with the movement, that person going to a protest probably better understands the movement, right? Regardless if they posted a black screen, if now they quote unquote think it's trendy to go to a protest, they actually are engaging with the movement, right? Even if their intentions were poor, you're still getting those same benefits and you're still mobilizing those same people, right? I don't think that that's something that like is like a net harm on our side of the house. I think that when Emily frames this debate at the very beginning, when she tells us that like, you know what, social media doesn't exist, you probably only hang out with people that have your same views, right? There's a reason that a lot of like Republicans end up like growing up in a completely Republican household and carrying the views that their parents give them, right? Where do you change those views when the only news thing that your parents put on is like Fox News? That's the only thing you see on the TV. When all of your friends in your really like white town only care about those same things that you do, and you're never exposed to like people who have like less fortune than you or have like different circumstances, right? This happens on social media specifically because it's also a means to engage with those people, right? To ask those people questions, to actually just like have a conversation the same way on Twitter, right? It doesn't happen overnight that suddenly you are like an extremely diehard Republican and now you care about people's rights. That doesn't necessarily happen overnight, but I think when you're constantly engaging with this, this does. So for the reasons of like not abiding by ethical purity, actual engagement and political action, we are so proud to propose.
Okay, so the entire case 4 that has been presented today is that when you have a good group of friends who care about the issues, they will drag other people into it when they see that on social media. They will put pressure on people. They will do these things to make sure that you get better engagement. Okay, here's the reality. That kind of interaction or those kinds of people, like right there, they identify what the problem is. Because in order for that solution to work, you still need to be engaging with a decently progressive group, or you still need to be engaging with people who will do that work for you in the first place. And the reason I think this is important is because if you take away social media, presumably those people would still do the same things just through normal institutions. So through the workplace, or through, like your everyday interactions, or through schooling or that kind of thing. And I think those kinds of interactions are like still going to exist on our side of the house. They also have this sort of weird implicit assumption that before social media existed, there were no grassroots movements, there were no labor unions. But the reality is, like, there were tons of movements that existed pre-like 2000s era when there wasn't social media being so prevalent, right? Like, we can talk about the civil rights movement. We could talk about like the early stages of feminism, right? Like, these were movements that existed and were able to collectivize and gain supporters just through normal institutions. So they didn't require social media in order to do that. Why we say social media is specifically bad for doing a lot of these things is because, like, all of the reasons that Aiden told you, right? He tells you that, like, basically it makes it a game of likes and, like, comments, It's no longer about those kind of things. And these are also the people that we think we're losing on their side of the house. And yes, we're willing to concede we get less numbers. That's something we're willing to say. But the reality is those people who are not engaging are not the people who are going to be going out there and doing, like, the voting and the lobbying power, are not the people who are going to be out there to be able to, like, really actively engaging with this society anyways. All they're doing it for is for their own performance and for their own inclusivity, to feel as if they're doing something value, when in reality, they're actually making it harder for those problems to actually exist now, because you can't actually have these ties to this political person. You also change the social media game, where you change the way that things are seen as important based on likes and numbers now, right? So the things that are seen as valuable with society, or the things that are like pop culture, or like things that you should be paying attention to, are the things that get lots of likes on Facebook and Twitter and stuff like that now. That drowns out a lot of other issues that maybe are, like, really important, but necessarily can't get the same kind of airtime because these people don't have that same kind of power. I think that's something that's really bad as well. Okay, I want to talk then about how they talk about, like, how it, like, gets people to do voting and lobbying power and all these other things. Because recognize that those harms are also symmetric, right? So on the right side, you can also have these social media groups create lobbying power, create voting, and bringing these people in. And in fact, we would say it actually benefits their side more, or getting rid of those progressives more, because what it means is that a lot of conservatives will show up and feel like they have voted and done something valuable in order to do that sort of thing, right? And so what you get on their side of the house is actually you make it harder for the left to be able to collectivize, to be able to create actual change through the kind of democracy kind of things. I also want to point out another harm that they did point out. When you have a massive, large movement like that's created, where you just have like 20,000 people now, as opposed to like smaller insular groups of people who actually care about things, I think what you can get is you can also get more people who are just trolling these events and like making them actually harmful and inactive for a lot of people who showed up. So recognize that a lot of white anarchists like to show up to these sort of BLM events and just actually do a bunch of shit and like cause a lot of trauma and cause a lot of damage within these areas. And the reason they're able to do that is because it's so prevalent on social media, because it's something that's spread so widely and so accessibly for everybody. We think we would rather have it be smaller, but we think in that case we wouldn't be tied to anything. It wouldn't be based on likes. It wouldn't be based on things. It would be more present in it would be more things like the civil rights movement. It would be more things like early stages of feminism. But we still think that those things were able to create actual concessions within the government. And we would say we actually get a better concessions out of them because you actually have a lot more support. So proud to oppose.
That marks the end of our two debates. Thank you so much for joining us at tonight's event. Make sure to check out The Observer, Queen's University's own international relations publication. We would like to give a huge thank you to Emily, Livy, Brent, and Aiden from the Queen's Debating Union, who participated this evening and did an amazing job covering all the topics we laid out for them. Thanks so much for joining us.